What the biggest example of failure I could think of, I thought the 200 consecutive new compounds for heart failure that were entered into large phase 3 trials, and every single one of them failed, just because everybody thought a failing heart needs to be made to work harder. In actual fact, the heart has already adapted physiologically to the conditions it's under, and that was to some extent predictable. And also about the cost, we've heard sort of mentioned about billions of dollars, but also that all hats at only about $100 million, which is incredibly cheap to form conclusions about a series of classes of compounds, entire classes, not just individual drugs. And then about UKPDS, the diabetic study in the UK, phenomenally important, run at a fraction of that cost, tells you which diabetic drug is most likely to give roughly how much benefit. Then I thought about the MRC hypertension trial before that, again run on a very small budget. If you're unfortunate enough to have a heart attack and want to know whether you should have a thrombolysis or low-dose aspirin, a beta blocker, not take magnesium, all these come from the ISIS trials. Again, run at very small budgets, coming up with phenomenally powerful conclusions. And Ben's absolutely right. We need a sort of better data with somebody, with a stakeholder with a long-term view, that once the pharmaceutical industry has released the product, that there's time to look at things like mortality, which is such a cheap and wonderful endpoint. So, where there's no debate, you don't have to form a committee to decide whether this person's alive or dead. So, for the panel, we had this concept about why they fail. I think we're all interested in perhaps not wasting resource. Maybe that's what we mean by fail. And we have Thomas, who's just given an excellent talk, as obviously Ben, as you heard, with all his enthusiasm. We also have from the MHRA, we have Kirsty Weidenbach, who's involved with assessing clinical trials when they come into the clinical trials unit and first proposals. And we're also, George Smukler, also from the MHRA, he's inputting into 370 trials, he tells me, again on a very small budget through the MHRA. And Ira Spector, formerly from Allergan. So perhaps we could just ask the panelists who haven't talked already just to say a few words. Perhaps we could start with Ira, just to say a sentence or two, just by way of introduction, of what you thought about this topic.
So hi, I'm Ira Spector. Met many people this morning. I think of clinical trials as not really failing. I think of them as giving us important data. They teach us things. They tell us things. If they're designed properly, they have an outcome that we should learn from. To be a failure is if we run a very large, very expensive trial and we don't learn anything, or if we don't enroll the trial. That's a failure. But the failure is the waste that we have to society and the patients who desperately need treatment. And we, as the stewards of those processes, need to be as efficient and as effective as we can be in what we do, so that we're spending those limited resources and limited time as effectively as possible. But we ought to be learning even from the failures, because I want to fail early and fast rather than late and expensive. That's really the dilemma.
And Kirsty, I wonder if you could just say just briefly what you do, because just for the people we haven't heard from yet. So.
I work in the clinical trials unit in the MHRA. We only deal on a case-by-case basis on approving trials. We're separate to the other parts of the licensing division, which deal with the ultimate package that you submit at the end for your marketing authorization. So we have a slightly different perspective on clinical trials. We look at each one individually as it comes in. And it's been interesting to hear today about why, from your perspective, you think the trials are failing. And I know we're obviously, a lot of the time we're seen as the big bang regulator, and I think, Thomas, you said it very eloquently just earlier, that we're perceived as always saying no. The answer is going to be no. And yet, from what I've heard, there's a lot of innovation going on out there, and it's part of our role, it's a key part of our role to support you in that innovation. If only you'd come and talk to us. We would love to hear a lot more about what is going on out there. We might not be able to give you an answer there and then, but we've got a lot of expertise within the MHRA, and if we don't have it in-house, we have access to the whole of Europe, or other agencies, the FDA, we do talk to them. And I think if industry came to us with what they want to do, then yes, occasionally the answer might be no, but actually we need challenging as well. So I think come to talk to us and challenge us. You might be surprised, and it would certainly be good for us, I think, as a regulator to see a lot more innovation, and for us to challenge our own conservative approach a lot of the time.
And George, just for the benefit of the audience, could you just introduce roughly what your budget is and what your input is into this sort of topic?
Right. I think this is working. I'm not MHRA, I'm MHRN. So that's one of the research networks, clinical research networks of NIHR. My main interest is in patient and public involvement in research. And our organisation, over the last 10 years of our existence, has learned an awful lot about engaging patients in research as collaborators or partners. Not as, we're not interested, well, we are interested, but I'm not addressing the issue of recruiting patients as participants in research. Although that's one of the major benefits of actually involving patients in the conduct of research as partners. So we heard a little bit from Thomas. We've got a lot of experience now in the different impacts that engaging patients as partners in research can have, engaging them throughout the entire research enterprise, not just in the formulation of the protocol, but yes, the question, what is the meaningful question for people who have a particular condition? What would be an acceptable design, a design that somebody would actually be prepared to participate in that sort of study? What would be meaningful outcome measures rather than those measures that psychiatrists think is important? Delusions and hallucinations are quite horrible, but for the patient with schizophrenia, these may actually not be the major things. They may want some kind of structured social life, some meaning, meaningful employment and those sorts of things. And we've done some work which has really shocked me concerning the low regard that patients have for the common outcome measures used in mental health treatments. And then there's the interpreter. We have some patients who actually conduct research as interviewers, and they may get quite different kinds of responses to the non-patient interviewers. And then there's the interpretation of the results, which could have quite a different meaning to patients compared with researchers. And then, of course, there's the dissemination, where patients are often the strongest advocates for the successful outcomes of research, and prospective purchasers will take a lot more notice of patients than they need if there is good evidence that an intervention works. There are different ways of involving patients through this process. Our commonest is to have patients on a management committee or on a trial steering committee. But there are lots of other ways, we can talk about that later on. And we have some evidence now that this does make quite a major impact. So we've looked at 370 odd studies that have been on the network and found that the more intensive the patient involvement, particularly at the beginning, the better the recruitment of participants to the study.
So the new internet uprising is the patient spring, I suppose. Yeah. So anyway, so I'd like to go to the floor and ask who's on the panel. Anybody has any questions as to address the panel? We've got regulators, we've got pharmaceutical, we've got an advocate of the prescriber. Has anybody got any thoughts they want to ask?
Given that I think everyone agreed that a clinical trial doesn't necessarily fail because it gives you a negative result,
typically in science, in a university, if you're going to do some research, you can have a negative experiment, but the outcome isn't necessarily a failure. You can learn a great deal from it, providing you publish the information in a straightforward and honest way. So why is it that not all clinical trial information, regardless of whether it's positive or negative, is published?
I've got 3 microphones in my hand. The bottom line is, in the past it was a cultural blind spot, and it's extraordinary really to think that the notion of doing a systematic review is so young. Up until the late 1980s, really, we did narrative reviews. People thought it was acceptable to cherry pick. Since 1986, we've had good quality quantitative evidence on the impacts that withheld negative results has on clinical practice. And I think what's striking since then is that it ceased to be an accident and it started to be a matter of active campaign. So it disappoints me enormously. Firstly, every regulatory change, every code of conduct that has been brought in to try and improve the problem of publication bias has failed, and it's failed largely through lack of transparent audit, which is the first step before you even get to enforcement. So, for example, we thought the FDA Amendment Act 2007 had meant that people posted all their trial results on clinicaltrials.gov. There was no audit, and when it was finally done and published, it turned out 4 out of 5 trials ignored it. We also know, of course, that the regulation hasn't been implemented with the kind of fines that we would expect. So I think the reality now is that we've failed to pass legislation, we've failed to create regulations, we've failed to create an information architecture where we even know what's missing. And the only answer I can offer on how to improve it is that we have to independently improve audit. So that's what we're doing with the Open Knowledge Foundation. We're building a database called the Open Trials Database, where we are, for the first time, linking together databases on trials that have been conducted and completed with documentation around trials. So that's not just places where the results are posted, but also we're trying to gather in trial paperwork, like, for example, consent forms. And from that we can derive secondary variables like how much information is missing on this drug. We can rank different types of sponsor, and it's not just industry, it's also academic trials that go unpublished. And we can produce clear ranked tables of where people stand on how transparent they are. And I suspect that that is probably the only way forward, is to create good quality evidence on how much evidence is missing. I would also say that in the process of creating that database, we've come across some other things which I think are relevant to the problems of bad design in clinical trials themselves. Like, for example, the lack of access to good quality documentation. I'm often amazed, actually, that people participate in some of the trials that I see. When I see a rheumatoid trial where people are deprived of a disease-modifying agent to be given a placebo when looking at a new rheumatoid arthritis trial, my first question is, what was the patient information sheet? What was the consent for? Did you actually tell people that they were going to be deprived of an effective treatment? And I think one of the first steps towards getting more patient engagement is also to get greater transparency around the design of trials. So what we're hoping to do with Open Trials as well, with protocols, is to try and get, whether they're MSc clinical trials students up to profs, get people reviewing the protocols of trials in progress and try to create a good trials guide so that people can say, while the trial is in progress, does this trial address a relevant question? Because I think if we can get informed patients feeding back, then that will help too.
John, I wondered if I just, for the record, first of all, congratulate Ben on pointing the mirror at us, guilty as charged in the past. But for the record, published last month in the Current Medical Research Opinion peer-reviewed journal, all of those studies for which licenses have been applied for since 2010, the figure of non-disclosure is down to less than 10%. So yes, guilty as charged in the past, but now, well, published peer-reviewed then. And the other point about placebo-controlled trials, I think Jeff Casher, if he's still in the audience, was saying this morning that on his website it talks about 90% of the studies not being placebo-controlled. But Jeff, you can perhaps explain that.
No, that was for oncology trials.
Oh, thank you.
The fact is that 99% of all oncology trials, someone gets therapy or not gets placebo. That does differ from other therapeutic areas.
Thank you.
So you might think, well, what's the point of publishing negative results? We're not interested in those if they get buried. That's the thing. But less than about a mile away from here, Francis Galton stood on a soapbox in 1851 in the Great Exhibition, and he noticed that measuring families' heights, that the very, very tall people tended to regress to more average height with succeeding generations of small people also. And so this ended up the concept of regression to mediocrity, called it. We now know it as regression to the mean. And the importance of this is if you throw 100 darts at the dartboard and one dart hits the bullseye, you can't pull out that and say, this is the magic dart that's going to be... So the illustration for negative trials is, for example, with antidepressants. You may see Irving Kirsch say, okay, we've got 100 drugs, 25 have been accepted by the FDA. I want to see the 25 that were turned down by the FDA, because when you put those together, actually you get a much bigger picture of the antidepressant class. But what he's not been able to look at is the 50 drugs that were submitted to, that weren't submitted to the FDA, the really negative data. And so negative data are incredibly important if you want a big class of compounds to evaluate the overall effect size in terms of regression. I don't know if anybody else has any negative data on the panel, because it's an important point.
Just one sentence really. Again, if you listen or read a lot of hype about big data, analyzing priors, comes mostly from mouths of the same guy who is saying we're not going to disclose our negative trials because it's competitive disadvantage. I'll say no more. You want to analyze big data, but you're not allowing yourself, in fact, because they're not visible, believe it or not. The fact that negative trials are not published to the external world doesn't mean that people in the particular company can see it. No, they can't. Statisticians saw it, negative, boom, closed. That's how true this industry is about analyzing big data.
But that's a cultural leadership issue, because we grow up in a competitive industry where people get ahead by being associated with winning projects, right? It got to market, it's a winning project. Well, sometimes we learn the most from studies that didn't have the outcome we expected, and we call them failed. But in fact, we should be learning from them. And if we have the right culture internally to have the guts to admit it and learn from them, well, then we'll get somewhere. But if we bury them, we won't. We'll just repeat them. And it's all about leadership in the end.
I don't mean to trample in at all. No, 3 again. But I think there's also an important issue here about documenting failure, because I've been in rooms like this where people grumble about the things that regulators have inflicted upon them, and I share those grumbles, right? Absolutely 100%. In fact, if you want to read 100 pages of us grumbling, our report on the barriers created partially by the MHRA to our trial of statins has been fast-tracked by NIHR, and I think it's been published already. And there's lots of stuff in there about, for example, NHRA, the trials inspectors' heads kind of exploded when they said they wanted to do site visits, when we said, well, there isn't really a site for you to visit. There's about 2 patients from different general practices. And then they said, well, we want to compare the original documentation of the GP record against the trial record, the clinical report form. I said, well, they're both exactly the same thing, because we're using GP's electronic records to gather the follow-up data. And then we went fully through the looking glass when they said, well, we want to make sure that the people who are taking the bloods for research purposes are trained in research and understand about clinical trials. And so, well, they're just the nurses in the practice, they're just the people who take bloods anyway. There's nothing different or strange about them. And so then we had to have special training for the people who were taking bloods, who were taking the blood anyway, and it was just an extraordinary thing. But what we've done is we've written all of that down and we put it in our report. And we've looked around elsewhere for these kinds of kind of real-world reports on the barriers that people face. And it's very hard to find that kind of stuff in black and white. I think actually that kind of knowledge about the barriers to the kind of innovation that we're talking about, the kind of efficiencies that we're trying to create, is often captured in the kind of the chat in the queue for the toilets at conferences like these. It's the chat in the queue for check-in. It's not being written down in black and white. And in fact, in many cases, as Thomas said, people don't even bother to apply to try and get things turned down. They just go, well, the regulators will turn it down anyway. So it's absolutely important that we publish the results of clinical trials, and my God, I'm all for England on that topic. But I think it's also really important that we publish in black and white, not just grumbles, not formless grumbles, but concrete black and white in careful detail, where we've been prevented from doing efficient research, so that we can learn from that and so that we can have an informed conversation with people from the MHRA, rather than the kind of awful things that I'm sure you have to endure, where people go, oh, you're terrible, you stopped us from doing X, and X is probably grotesquely overstated.
So it's an important issue of not wasting resources, isn't it, so Kirsty?
I think just to follow on from that, I think, for the issues that you have. But I think it's actually issues such as that we need to have to a certain, because if people such as yourself aren't challenging the inspectorate and challenging clinical trial approvals and what we can and can't do, but believe me, we do see the same protocol templates coming through again and again, and the inspectors will see the same sort of trials being run again and again in the same old-fashioned way. If no one is actually challenging what we're doing, and no one's coming to us with all these amazing innovations that seem to be out there, then we can't change anything either. It might take a little while, and I think someone earlier this morning said that we're about 10 years behind. And to be honest, I don't disagree. We might take a little while to catch up, but we're never going to even start to try and catch up if people don't challenge us in the first place.
We'll just switch back to the audience just for a second, so because I know we're switched.
Sorry, I just wanted to say that I work in publishing, and I get the same thing that I've heard quite a lot for the regulators, in that people say, oh, you would never accept this, you'd never publish it, it'd just get rejected, it's not interesting.